Muy buenos días.
Good morning. Greetings from to all the participants for the activity of today. Please receive greetings from the CISS and the Center of Studies, CIESS. We are here to share with you the policy study on risk factors at work, psychosocial risk identification, analysis, and prevention. This was made in collaboration with the American Commission, Legal and Social, and the American Commission for Prevention of Labor Risks. Two researchers participated, two specialists, Dr. Jorge Luis Pons and Dr. Javier Garcia Rios. The activity today will be in charge of Dr. Javier Garcia Rivas, and we will have the participation of Dr. Javier Garcia as a speaker, Dr. Jorge Luis Arcelin Font, Dr. Graciela Gil Montalvo, chair of the American Commission for Labor Risk Prevention, and Dr. Veronica Gil Paz. Uh, she's a consultant of AMZ consultant. Dr. Javier Rios is a doctor of public health. Thank you for participating today and for your research. Together with Dr. Ordelin, he's a doctor of public health by the University of California, campus even in the United States, and he has a master's degree in organizational psychology given by the University of the Autonomous University of Morelos. He has a postgraduate study at the University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA. He has been a teacher at the San Martin de Porres University in Peru, and the University of California, and the Autonomous University of the state of Morelos, and the CETIS of the University of Mexicali in Mexico. He has more than 10 years of labor health. He has published several articles in books and magazines. He has been a speaker in international events and a consultant in the factors of psychosocial risks at work. He's a specialist now for the Commission of Work Risk Prevention for the CISS and for the conference also. He then, Javiera, you can give you the floor and just wait for people to take advantage of this morning on this so important study that puts forward all the advancements that we have on the policy advancements for the psychosocial risks that we have to face in the different countries at work for the implementation of this policy. Thank you very much, Doctor. Welcome all of you that are with us virtually. This afternoon, as Dr. Daisy said, we will be presenting the publishing of the factors of psychosocial risk at work, identification, analysis, and prevention that I did together with Dr. Jorge Luis Orbelin Pons. In the minutes to come, we'll be talking about some concepts about the psychosocial risk factors and the content of the document. If you help me with the slides, please. Okay. Next, please. And as I was saying, we'll be talking for the next minutes, we'll be discussing about the content of the document, specifically about the objectives that we chase and some theoretical concepts, the methodology that was implemented for the task, and some of the conclusions that we got. Then we'll have the comment by Dr. Graciela Gil Montalvo, who's the chair of the American Commission for Labor Work Risks, and a comment on the document from Dr. Veronica Gil Paz, who's an expert on the matter. And in this case, in the case of Mexican norm 035, and then we'll have a Q&A session, and we'll close with by saying goodbye. With any further ado, then we'll start talking about our presentation. Please, next slide.
Pues como les decía, este es un
Well, then,
trabajo
as
que
I
como
said, this is something that as a research team, we're proud because we have two perspectives of research and analysis from the psychosocial point of view, which is the area that I work for in, and the legal part, which is the area where Dr. Ardelin Ford works. So this is the very first step to talk about the interesting topics from the commissions from my transdisciplinary point of view. And this is one of the virtues that we have in this research group, that we have different backgrounds and experiences that will help us deal with these topics in a multidisciplinary way. So this is the purpose of this study, which is to analyze. The analysis will allow us to give a detailed scope and view on the countries that have this regulation between the factors of psychosocial risks and identifying the legal, theoretical, and methodological ways that we have in every country. And we hope that the work will help, will be used as a starting point for those countries that are developing these regulations for the following up, and vigilance of these factors. So it's not only an analysis of the countries that already have this the regulations, but also for those countries that are planning to implement this kind of regulations. So before I continue, we must clarify the core topic of this document, which are the psychosocial factors. So if we take the definition of the mixed committee between the ILO and WHO, they define these factors of the results of the interactions between the environment at work, the satisfaction at work, and the conditions of the organization on one side. On the other hand, the capabilities, needs, and workers' expectations, considering their habits and the conditions outside work. So these two elements interacting within the organization may have an influence in the performance of the worker, their satisfaction, and most importantly, their physical and mental health of workers. This is a concept that has certain coincidences with some other elements, some other concepts associated, and some of them known as work-life quality. But if we see the definition by the NIOSH in the United States, it talks about measuring the relationship. This really relates to the questionnaire they use to measure life quality at work. And it says that the questionnaire helps us to measure the relationship between the organizational laboral conditions and the health of the worker. So if you see, we have these coincidences with the definition that we previously gave about the psychosocial factors from ILO and WHO. On the other hand, we have some other factors that are defined as environments of psychosocial work in Nordic countries. For example, in Norway, our university talks about this concept as a collective term that covers the interaction between the people and the place of work, the individual, and the impact on the employee and the culture of the organization. So if we see, there are many coincidences, but we talk about the same, but it is important also to consider these three core elements, which are the organization, everything that happens within it, the worker, its personal characteristics, and the consequences, in this case, on health and productivity. These concepts also, these three elements are what do some researchers in the term of quality of work, life, the input and the output. Well, then, these sometimes lack of consensus, something that brings all these topics, generally is taking the concept of stress as a core part. But it is also important to clarify what we mean by stress. We sometimes identify stress on a daily basis, basically as the manifestation or the psychosomatic manifestations, that is to say, headache, body tension, and even some other manifestations in skin. So it is important to clarify that we're what we mean by stress. Now, this concept obviously has been developing very much from the 20s with the definition of canon about the conception or conceptualization of fight or flight. And later on with the Hansel research in 1936 about what he describes as the general adaptation syndrome. He says that all organisms suffer in some way to adapt to the environment. And so this concept later on has been used as basically the answer to stress. Nevertheless, there are some other concepts. And in this case, the concept of stress, we're going to leave it away a little while and we'll leave it in like this in the document, like the psychophysiologic response before a threat, either real or perceived by the individual, but basically is the response that we give before this threat. There are some other concepts like distress, which is the response to the chronicity of the threat. And that is to say, it's not the same to face danger while you're driving and then you dodge or do anything, or and later on you stay normal. And in the case of distress, it's a response of a constant, being constantly alert. The stressors refer to the conditions of the surroundings which are threatening to the individual. There are some other models that we deal with in the document, such as the control, the demand model, effort, and award model. So many of these are based, many of our research is based on this kind of models, and there are some concepts like job strain, which is called as tensión laboral in Spanish. I've talked about the symptoms of stress, which is what we most commonly identify, which are, I insist, like headache, uh, loss of hair, but there are some other topics. There is a positive stress. So if there are some demands where our capabilities are able to address these demands or face these demands or requirements, we obviously have this stage where stress becomes a challenge, a positive challenge. So that's the eustress, which is we called as we call positive stress. Then I already told you that something that worries us, and in this case, what we try to deal with this legislation or regulations about psychosocial risk factors are actually these surroundings threatening, psychologically threatening at work, but they're chronicle. I also told you that this perception of or self-assessment of stress can be real or perceived. But let's say that in the physiological terms, it doesn't really matter whether they're real or not, or we perceive them as threatening, because the body responds the same way. So it is important then to make a difference. In the previous slide, I was presenting the book by Robert Sapolsky, which talks about why zebras do not suffer ulcers. Basically, he says in one of the chapters that they don't suffer from ulcers because physiologically, the zebra, when they see themselves in danger, when he is threatened or they're threatened by a lion, one out of two, they die at the moment, or they already have escaped and they have this balanced state, which is called as homeostasis, and they can continue with their normal life. So in this case, facing an acute threatening will allow us to come back to this inner balance. And nevertheless, when we face this threat and this threat continues, we have this biological response and this biological alteration. And then later on, we have some symptoms. So this chronicity, if it is chronical, there are some other concepts like allostasis, which is the adaptation to these threats. But the point important that we have to talk about here is that there is a moment where our psychological and physiological capability is not enough to face these threats. Next, please. So there is a series of examples and concepts that we study at this labor health area, but it is important that we keep in mind this idea of things being chronicle, because when we collect data or when we have this analysis or surveillance of these risk factors, we must be doing this constantly. It's not recommendable to, have a unique measurement that will give us an important view of on the current state of the organization. But the continuous gathering will allow us to go beyond finding associations or scientifically, it is possible to determine cause links. And this is an important term because when we make a decision in an organization, it is important in order to make a precise prediction. So even though many of the regulations and legislations that we find do not talk about the continuous assessment and the continuous surveillance, this is an element that we have to keep in mind all the time. Next, please. And then one of the strategies or common strategies to deal with this problem of psychosocial risk factors, once workers are diagnosed by stress, it is to establish individual intervention programs, such as practicing yoga or doing exercise, strengthening resilience of the employee, giving stress dealing tools like mindfulness. All of those are useful, but do not address the problem from its roots. And so this is what I was talking to you about, having an adequate detection in order to identify the cause, the line of causes, you know. And so in order to talk about this problem from its roots, from its origins, we have to have an adequate assessment. But as I was talking to you about these common interventions, they help, but unhappily, they end up being a very expensive palliative for the company, the worker, and the social security organizations or institutions, and the society in general. So what is the idea or spirit of this legislation or regulations or policies about the psychosocial risk factors, to deal with it or go for the primary prevention to avoid the development of the disease or control the risk factor. Many times, or some critics of this area say that they focus a lot on the negative. Why not focusing on the positive things? But what can be more positive than the preventive cases like avoiding violence at work? Well, when we have a blood analysis to determine the cholesterol levels, we do not say the doctor that is focusing on the negative. This preventing focus is already positive. But even this positive idea of work is addressed by some of the policies or norms. Norm 035 in Mexico talks about favorable work environment. So we're dealing with this part too. And so from now on, I will give the floor to Dr. Jorge Luis Ordelin Font, who is going to talk about the methodology that we used and the results at work. Okay. Good morning. Thank you very much to all of you that are listening to us. Many thanks to the commissions and the American Commission for Work Risk Preventions that are with us. Our request for this study, and the Legal Commission has one of the mandates to have a norm or policy analysis about the different topics. And one of these topics was the psychosocial risks at work. So it is a pleasure to have this panel and run this study together with my colleague Javier, because we have a very multidisciplinary perspective. Interdisciplinary, which we sometimes have the regulations and we can take a look at the regulations, but the scope in this so complex topics and diverse topics, those that we have them with a specialist with all this context that has even by Javier can be taken to a regulation. And the first time we said, well, there are any regulations about this. And when we talk about legal norms, we're not talking about a system in a literal sense of regulation. We had to widen this. This is something that we use in the document. Not only the actual legal norm, which is issued by a power of the state, either the legislative. And this is important because it goes to the effects too. And the idea, the first moment was like having a snapshot of what we have in the Americas regarding this issue, regarding legal terms, using the method that besides the traditional methods for social science and the specifics for the psychology, we had to use the compared legislation method. And so we see what are the similarities and differences between the different regulations that have or give an answer to different contexts. And this is important because we have to consider this. We have to consider these characteristics to analyze the limitations too later on. But I'd say that we have what we had thought of. We had the snapshot about the topic, at least from the point of view about regulation and policy making. So from there on, we had an analysis. And one thing that is important to consider is that for that, we based these in this kind of regulations that are mandatory for the public. In a certain moment, we were not able to continue this. It was last year, but we didn't analyze the subsequent modifications of these protocols. And this is one of the characteristics that this research has. And we acknowledge as part of the limitation of this first study. But some of our countries, some of the countries that we consulted in Chile, Mexico with the norm 035 in 2018, and the inspection guide in Costa Rica. And also we analyzed some other regulations such as the 29,183 law in Peru. Because when we search, we will not only find protocols, norm and guides, but it can also be like in Peru, that evidently we do not have a specific regulation, but when the risk regulation, the work risks, we had it.
We had very expressly, very briefly, how to deal or how to tackle a little bit with everything pertaining regulation of psychosocial risks in the work environment. And from there, we had to choose or rather determine some items which we consider were essential to be able to carry out this regulatory analysis based on all those elements that Javier mentioned. How that this analysis, this doctrine discussion, even this scientific discussion that happens socially might transcend into regulatory environment, which are the differences in how is this regulated. And that's what you will be able to find in the study we put together. And again, based on that, I will give you some considerations, the most transcendent, most importance, and also take into consideration some of our most important conclusions. So what's first thing is that very little countries in the region have developed this, at least in the work endangerment superintendent, social provision, and so on and so forth. And this one first limitation was first thing that we have. So the region, the Americas, understood in very broad sense, has not rendered enough attention to this subject matter, which will lead for it to be boosted and fostered. And that's something that we at CIESS are trying to carry out. And this webinar and this document are part of that work, how to be able to boost this type of regulations in the region. Another issue, I already talked about that, but it's also important to take into consideration is the diversity in instruments. And we talk about diversity in instruments. This one is very important because not all instruments, when you regulate, will have the same binding effect. It's not the same as, making a regulation, a reform decree is supposed to establish a guideline or protocol. Why? Because guidelines or protocols could be under certain circumstances not having the same effect or same binding ability. And something else that we took into consideration is scope, because these don't always have the same scope. They're not always regulated the same. Dr. Javier mentioned something very important. It is, of course, interesting that we make ourselves aware that the study of this specific type of risk is not only beneficial for the worker, it's beneficial for the employer and beneficial for the state. Because when states make these guidelines or regulations part of a public policy, we will have a better projection on each, or the implementation in each of these regulations, and to avoid this type of psychosocial risks. However, there's something that's also very important, making the employer aware. Why? Because it is the employer, not only because they have a regulation, have to do it or follow it, but the employer needs to make visible that when he's implementing this type of procedures, establishing prevention plans, action measures, they're not only benefiting the worker, the employee, they're benefiting themselves in terms of benefits, social security. They're benefiting themselves in creating a better work environment, and obviously attaining positive effects on work. And we consider that this is something very important, something we should be working upon towards sensitization to achieve a larger impact, because at the end of the day, we're not doing anything if we manage to have some sort of regulations put in place, but we don't achieve their implementation. And if this implementation cannot be carried out through coercion, but rather being acknowledged by each of our companies, that this will render better and most positive effects than what we've achieved so far. Another important aspect that we need to take into consideration is that it's very hard, and it's something. Please, next slide. And we've also taken into consideration is that, of course, not every single piece of regulation established alike. Regulations should respond to the concrete realities of each of our countries. And at the same time, this subject matter that's not very easy to regulate, because like we were able to see in this first part, Javier presented, there are different theoretical issues, a series of debates going on. So you cannot clearly determine every single time what these factors are. And when you cannot clearly determine these factors, well, this is an ongoing discussion that goes into the regulatory environment, in that sometimes it's not clear to us that it is a regulation set forth in a given rule, like the Mexican regulation that establishes more concretely which are these factors. This numbering is what you call in law numerus apertus. So this regulation that you're setting forth, that includes other factors, and or am I only going to take into consideration these factors? How these concepts that I'm providing in the law can I apply to different concepts, because it's not the same analyzing a factor in a given system, like workers certain type or with certain type of obligation, as opposed to other regulations in the mining sectors or medicine, which has been really harshly affected by the pandemic. So this entails necessarily an interpretation exercise, and it mandatorily needs to, for us to determine the scope of each of these considerations. Another aspect that we deem important is assessment or evaluation. And evaluation not only in applying the instrument, like Javier explained. There are several types of instruments, and there's something that's very important. Most of these instruments happen or made in other contexts that do not belong to our realities. So, I mean, as an example, you can analyze what Ecuador is setting forth, and they won't have a given type of instrument. They just say that this needs to be an instrument that's officially validated, because it says that you need to apply the instrument independent from the conditions that you might have in each of the companies, in each of the institutions or labor institutions you would like to identify. However, we can have into consideration the regime of regulation in Colombia, which is a very advanced regulation in which not only are they talking about this possibility, but they're giving us a series of instruments. And they tell whoever carries out this activity, you're free to choose which of these instruments you're going to apply depending upon the concrete situation you've been faced against. I mean, you or the company or the institution or the employer to be applied or analyzed. Another important aspect is that the assessment is not limited to the application of the instrument or the creation of the conditions, but you need to go beyond. There's even strong analysis and protection of confidential information. Many times workers don't want to reply or to answer, or don't reply the best way possible, because they're afraid of certain retaliation. So can you warranty sensitive information in that instrument, which at the end of the day should render kind of certain results, for which you afterward need to adopt different measures or action plans. So that's yet another big challenge that we have in terms of implementations. It's not only protecting confidential information, but where will that stop? In the case of Chile doesn't only say that information is confidential, but the Chilean protocol sets forth that you have to summon the workers so that the work independently can explain to you the scope that he's going to answer. And you need to maintain that under strict confidentiality. And some other ordinances, like Colombians go even beyond. They say that results which are rendered under certain criteria where there's proof that there are concrete risks, well, that these people or this data needs to be protected the same way as medical data protected. Another aspect that we need to take into consideration is everything pertaining to action measures. There's something that I think is very important. It's not only how you're going to intervene, because intervention is important, but it's pretty much what we've been talking about so far. Up to what extent we're establishing that these are part of our prevention strategies. What point can we analyze that the study of effective risks are part of the compliance programs of companies, in which companies are not only concerned about certain activities or meeting certain conditions in matters of data protection, IT or data security, but security and prevention for the worker. So this is something that we would like to call upon attention. And yet another aspect that we deem It's interesting. Javier talked about it when he presented the importance of constant measuring and why. Why is this important, constant measuring? Because the factors, or these are ever-changing factors, are modifiable in terms of the conditions that's set for this factor. So this will bring about that you have to necessarily, or rather the employer needs to continuously work on this. We have identified, at least based on this study, two big models to be able to prevent. One first model, which is that talks about the periodicity of assessment, 1 to 2 years. That's the case of Mexico, one of the countries regulating that. Same goes for Ecuador, but we have yet another, which is a little bit more complex, in which periodicity is established independent of the type of factor that has been identified. So that means that the largest or more serious factors, you will need to establish periodicity in lesser time frame, because you need to assess, you need to evaluate whether action measures or intervention measures that you have adopted to be able to face the psychosocial factors that you have identified are evidently rendering results. And if they're not rendering these results, you will need to change course and propose other type of measures, because you also need to know whether measures are becoming more serious, and not measures, factors are becoming more serious or not. So I think that's also very important, because there's not a unique model or just one model in terms of measurement or action plan, because the action plan, intervention plans will respond to circumstances, and tomorrow it might respond even within one same company or one same institution, evidently, because factors are prone to changing. And this rigidity of law, trying to maintain it, because we need to take into consideration that we're in a constant evolution process, and this evolution should always be positive, because the action plan should respond again to each of these factors to be able to eliminate or counteract or decrease in as much as possible. And lastly, there's something that we would like to talk about, is control, the role that the state has, and not only the state per se, ministries regarding the verification or control that these plans, these measures, or these identification measures are actually happening. But those, each country or each institution, and have in labor matters, because these companies are in charge of control, supervising that this is actually being carried out, not only the identification, but also the action control plan. And it's also very important, and requires more importance, the role of prevention. And prior to giving thanks for your time, we would like to comment on the limitations that we saw in this study, because all study or investigation research has limitation. Same goes for this, and that's why it's important for us to understand and acknowledge it. And first and foremost, I've already commented some limitations of the time they happen, and today we're living under completely different conditions. That is to say, these are conditions in which we have new factors, and how are these new factors expressed or materialized. So that is extremely important. However, we didn't consider that, because of that, the study's offsets. But it's some sort of starting point for us to know where we're heading towards, and how we supposed to correct each of the circumstances or each of these regulations. And again, something very important is to call attention on the fact that this is not limited to the regulatory environment or aspects. This goes way beyond. It touches the entrepreneurial, institutional environments, because that's where the worker is at. If we don't make laws to be truly efficient, in that acknowledged benefit reaches the state, the worker, and the employee, we won't be meeting the purpose of this regulation. And there's another aspect that we consider important. That's that we don't analyze, or we didn't take into consideration certain particularities in terms of professions. This is a study, this is a piece of research that we're doing. Javier will continue with this. It will be an ongoing research in terms of medicine. Medical staff. We need to broaden medical staff, not only specialist physicians And we're obviously thankful for them to be first-line responders in COVID, but in more broader sense, like janitorial staff, laboratory technicians. Again, this is a very encompassing piece of research, and you will get news of it through our social media when we publish a poll that we're carrying out specifically for this type of role players. And something else we forgot, and that's something that we deem as priority for treatment in this region, is the study of these risks before the new working conditions. Fundamentally, things like digital platforms. So this piece of research has one fundamental objective or function, and this is carrying out analysis, because at the end of the day, what we always need to strive for, what we need to accomplish, is that with pandemic, with what has happened, and we need to know where we're at and where we're heading towards. But of course, that cannot go in detriment of the objectives of sustainable development. That is, say, pandemic cannot mean going backwards, even if this piece of research is something that demonstrates that we do have limitations from the regulatory and application standpoint. To us, that's just a starting point towards we should go. We will never take a step back in terms of protection of labor rights and obviously prevention and security at work. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will pass the floor to my peer Javier. He will continue coordinating this webinar. Thank you very much, Jorge. So let's continue with our program, and we have some special guests. And of course, you can send your questions through the Q&A tab in Zoom, whoever's logged onto the session. And at the end, we will have a proper Q&A session. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to Dr. Graciela Gil Montalvo. Allow me to introduce her. She's our president, the president for the American Commission Prevention of Work Risks. She's a physician, a master's on public health and master's in work medicine, another master in work hazard prevention. She has a master's in assessment of bodily harm and master's on social security. She's a facilitator and OSHA auditor, health provided, certified by Ministerio de Salud y Trabajo de la Ciudad Dominicana. She's also director of the Latin American Association of Security and Health of the Workplace. She's also facilitator of the diploma course on social security from the National Council on Social Security and the Technical Professional Formation Institute. So after that formal introduction, Doctor, the floor is yours. Well, good afternoon, first and foremost. Thank you very much, Dr. Garcia. Today, I'm here to talk on behalf of the American Commission on Prevention of Work Hazards, who are placed in accompanying you to present the results of this regulatory study of psychosocial risk factors at work. And to be able to justify the interest of the American Commission of Prevention in work hazards or risks, I would like for our audience to allow me to remind you the mission of the American Commission, which is oriented towards supporting, providing counsel, and boosting the strengthening of a prevention culture when it comes to health and safety at work for the member countries of the conference through research, through cooperation, through transference of good practices, and of course, information in security and health at work. And of course, with the support of the Technical Secretariat and the Inter-American Center of Studies on Social Security, CIESS. So now, in the American Commission's work program for 2021, the Commission is trying to compile standards and best practices of member countries to monitor accidentability, fostering research on the work conditions, quality conditions, that is, and also boosting development of health and security disciplines at work. I'm talking about security, I'm talking about hygiene, I'm talking about medicine at the workplace, ergonomics, and of course, psychosociology in the workplace. This year, the American Commission Prevention of Work Risks within the research lines has psychosocial risk factors and work-life quality. Why talking about risks? I think it's worthwhile going over a little bit what my peers before me already highlighted, and that's the concept of psychosocial risk factors, as those factors related, at least those provided by ILO, on the one hand, with the content ILO, the leadership style, the conditions of that organization, and on the other, competencies and the need of workers, which undoubtedly will have an impact on well-being and health of workers and as in the work itself. So when we talk about psychosocial risk factors, we're talking about, as we have properly mentioned during this piece of research, conditions in the work environment. We're talking about responsibility, mental overburden, demand at work, lack of autonomy, leadership style, communication, harassment, violence, even including this relationship between family life and work life. So if we don't intervene, I mean, this will materialize in what we call labor risks. And we won't only see an acute stress, but chronic stress. We'll see things like workplace harassment, burnout syndrome. So that those are amongst others. Now, what is the important point here, like Dr. Ordelli before me mentioned, these are real conditions that threaten the lives of workers. And what will be the consequence of these stress factors? We'll see cardiovascular disease, respiratory diseases, immunitary, gastrointestinal, dermatologic, endocrinologist, musculoskeletal disease, and mental disease. So what's the challenge with this? Well, that the origin is very individual in nature, is very complex. So, I mean, this entails difficulties to be able to work in prevention, assessment, and control. Now, what's the advantage? Well, that these are predictives. Stress factors are predictive. So that means that we'll be able to work on them. But, of course, the hazards or risks in work environments related psychosocial factors. I mean, whenever you have a distraction, unsafe behaviors, so that those are triggers for work incidents or work accidents, work-related accidents. Fortunately, even in developing countries, like many other countries in the region, have a direct impact. And it's, I mean, this acknowledge human value because, I mean, the quality of product and production, like we mentioned, will be associated to the work-life quality. So given the fact that factors and psychosocial risks have a direct impact in work health, these need to be integrated. We need to foster them being integrated into the management system of companies. Why? To be able to create an organizational culture when it comes to work health, managed with assessment, timely and efficient intervention. And as a preventionist, I cannot stop pointing out the new emerging psychosocial risks derived from new technologies, coming from new raw materials, coming from new chemical and biological compounds, new production systems, because we all know, and especially at this point in time, that we're going through a situation like this pandemic. So traditional models have changed. quite a bit, probably because of this fluctuating economy, but there are new modalities of work, hiring, I mean, which are linked to the work relationships we already mentioned. On the other hand, this American Commission Prevention and Work Risk in the context of social security of psychosocial risk would like to invite all the countries for them to revise in the context Dr. Deline mentioned. I mean, within the possibilities, within the regulatory centers, but going over the professional ailments, some others call them work-related diseases, to try and revise that coverage scope and social protection before psychosocial risk factors. And finally, the American Commission Prevention Work Hazards, Work Risks, hopes that this presentation, that today's work has been fruitful, and we're convinced that this transversal subject regarding rights, security, and health goes in favor of the workers and to actually, strengthens or brings about strengthening and more encompassing vision of the health of our workers. So thank you very much, Dr. Garcia. The floor is back to you. Thank you very much, Doctor, for your kind words. We'll continue with Verónica Noemí Gil Paz. She will be talking about the document that we already shared with you. She's an expert on psychosocial risk factors, especially NOMO 35 in Mexico. I will now read her resume. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology by UNAM. She has a diploma course on psychosocial risk factors and in the PNSO Latin America program. She's been an assistant for workshop as implementation of standard 035 psychosocial risk factors. She has diploma courses on a theoretical basis of psychosocial risk factors, also through this PNSO program Latin America, as well as being a part of other workshops like in the National Federation of Health related items in Mexico. She's an analyst of psychosocial risk factors, and she's made studies in national and international companies. She's been a keynote speaker regarding the 035 standard in Mexico, and she's currently a consultant, and she provides assessment regarding the 035 regulation in Mexico. The floor is yours, Miss.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for the invitation that you gave me to give some comments on the study that you have made. I want to congratulate Dr. Javier and Dr. Jorge, because despite the limitations they face, they gave us a new perspective of new legislation and regulations that we have in America. So that's paramount, the contribution they have had. I'm thankful for the interest that they have in these topics, because they seem to be new, but it's something old in the society. And mental health is paramount, not only for work, but also for everything that is related to it. Sometimes we believe when we have a new norm, at least it happened in Mexico, we heard about the norm and we said, well, it's a new one, but it's lacking something. When I had a chance to read the study made by the doctors, I realized we are pioneers regarding these norms, and we can help other countries to have a wider perspective of what we can do regarding the psychosocial risk factors. So I am going to give my opinion on what I thought about this study. I believe it is important not only for people that deal with this psychosocial factor risks area, but for those people also who have an interest or also leave these repercussions on a daily basis at work. You know, the family is Dr. Javier shared with us. I believe that the concept that the ILO gave us is pretty clear about the relationships relationships that we have with our interactions at work or our culture, particularly. So I believe this article does not give us only information and it gives us light about the law regulation in the countries, but it invites us to reflect on what we can do and what we can implement. It gave me a perspective as the counselor on the psychosocial risk factors even in my work center, and I would like to highlight some important topics that I noticed in their studies. So the first one is that I believe it is fascinating the way they were structuring the study, because if you're just getting into this environment of the psychosocial factors environment, the way they show us the instruments and the measurement control measures, they give us a chance to see the way they are working with this. An example of this is the legislation of Ecuador, that it tells us that depending on the level of risk and when it has, we have to apply the tests. And I consider that is important because like here in Mexico, our norm does not give us this perspective. And that's something that companies hesitate about. And they say, well, how often should I do this and why is this periodicity? So knowing what the different norms present or legislation like the one in Colombia, which I consider to be one of the most complete ones, and the one from Ecuador, and we can take advantage of them because we can say, well, we can follow this plan. And at the same time, being a comparative study helps us know how we can interfere in the psychosocial risk factors. Depending on the country we're dealing with, we have to keep in mind that it is important that even if we would want to use any kind of instrument, we must standardize it. During the work that was presented in the policy study, we can see that each and every one of the questionnaires that occupy the different countries. The one which is mentioned the most is the lists that I believe most of the countries that have some sort of legislation of the psychosocial risk factors is our basis to standardize our norm. So it doesn't mean that a norm is better than another one, but it simply means that we can take advantage of what is being done in other countries so that we can complement our work in an company level at a work environment. For example, the Colombian norm talks about the evaluation of the psychological effects and the possible pathologies. And this is something that the Mexican norm does not take into consideration. We evaluate the psychosocial risk factors, but it is also a chance, I believe, to know that not only can we stop in discovering the risk factors, but also the effects that are causing diseases in our workers. One important aspect also is that we know that all over the world from the pandemic, we have detected psychosocial factors, and some of those were unknown. Even telework is a risk factor. Some others say that it is positive. It all depends on perspectives. We know that psychosocial risk factors depend on the perspective of the worker, the employee, but it's important to see along the document that we can see that even though we're different countries with different cultures and societies, economic conditions, some psychosocial risk factors prevail, such as the interference between work and family, the workload, the control over work. It is interesting to see how each and every one of the questionnaires that are presented in this study is towards this. And it has to do, as I was saying before, the kind of questionnaires that we choose as a basis. But we also, if we choose them or we select them is because they help us comply with the need in order to evaluate the factors of risk, psychosocial risks. So it invites us also to think about what is happening in our country. These psychosocial factor risks are prevailing and they're causing mental illnesses in workers in the world. And many times we do not really give the real importance it should have. So I think this reflection invites us to think about. And it also deals with one of the main psychological effects, which is stress. I thought it was pretty interesting the definition for stressors, what stress is and distress, etc. Because many times we use it without even thinking. Well, it has been very common ever since we have this 035 norm. Even the media say that the norm 035 qualifies stress, or now your employer should pay a certain amount if you are under stress, when it is not like that, but it is because of the lack of knowledge between the difference between a psychological effect and a psychosocial risk factor. So I believe the article really helps us make a difference between these two aspects, and it allows us also that by knowing them, we will be able to assess and interfere in a more effective way. So I really thank you for this part. It was pretty interesting, and together with this, I consider that if they give us other studies in the future, we will be able to see the psychological effects more, because that's the very first thing we see. We do not take a look at the factor or the cause of the illness, but the effect. We see it when the illness is already there, when they're under burnout, or when they have had serious stress or work violence. So most of legislations I can see do not consider this, but I consider it's pretty important, with the exception of the Colombian, as I said it. The rest do not consider this. So it is important to deal not only with stress, but also other psychological negative and positive effects, as Dr. Javier said. Not everything is bad. Not all factors are negative. So this is an opportunity to deal with this, not only on dealing with the negative part. About norm 035, I would only like to say that this Mexican norm, I would like to say that there is a part in the writing where it says that the employer must hire a verification unit to comply with this. So we could interpret it as such as a mandatory thing, when this indeed is not like that. The Ministry of Work, or Labor, which is the institution that regulates norm 035, gives it as an option. Still, the way they deal with every norm is pretty clear, dealing with whatever happens in all those countries regarding the psychosocial risk factors. And I would like to close my participation by stressing what the article caused in me, because the article does not precisely talk about the prevention specifically, but along the article, they tell us how important prevention is. Many times when we are related to industrial safety and psychosocial risk factors, ergonomic, chemical agents, so on and so forth, we all go and deal with the illness, interfere with the illness. And this article talks to us about prevention, how important prevention is in all countries, in this case, in the psychosocial risk factors. Sometimes it is obvious, but it should be a priority in every kind of legislation and norm. So I invite you to do this to prevent any sort of disease and not just wait until the disease is there. A company, in my experience, tells me that is gains more in many aspects if they interfere in a timely manner than if they just wait to give some compliance or make a solution when they have the problem in front of them. So there are some other studies that says that for every dollar that you invest in the company, they gain $4 more. So don't just let's see it from the economic aspect, but with the social commitment that we have for welfare. So I really thank you for this invitation. I congratulate you for the event. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. We really thank you for the comments from the document. Let's hope that our people, when they read the document, they will have a similar perception as yours. We'll then now go for our Q&A session. We have some questions from our audience. And let me go to the screen where I have these questions. We'll be answering, as much as we can, and then later on we'll be closing the activity with some closing words from Dr. Emma Juarez. So one of the questions that we have is, good afternoon. Will you send us the presentation or the study? Yes, the study will be available at the Inter-American Center of Social Security Studies webpage, and I understand that it is also going to be sent by email to the people that are registered and our member people, our members. And one more. How much do countries consider the recommendations about the ILO, specifically with their solve problem, integrating the promotion of health in the safety and health at work, regarding the psychosocial risks? I do not understand whether the country, the question talks about what the countries consider what we think. But when we talk about these psychosocial risk factors, they integrate this part that tries to have to deal with the ILO SOLVE program. So this SOLVE program by the ILO is very similar to a program that has been developed by the NIRS Institute, and it is a program called as a Total Worker Health, where they do the same, besides the prevention of accidents at the site of work, they integrate the promotion of health. That is to say, a healthy environment for workers. So in some way, these preventive ideas we have been saying, all the speakers today, we work with this idea of preventing the disease caused by the psychosocial risk factors, but also by promoting positively the health of workers. So we found that the laws and norms that we have analyzed for this task have this same preventing spirit. So next question is how to solve the problem of simulators and the pre-existences. If I understand the question well, I think it refers to the employers sometimes have workers that simulate being sick or simulate to be affected by some organizational things, or maybe having some medical pre-existences. If this is what it means, the question, I believe it is important to clarify once again that laws and norms, as well as the general study of the psychosocial risk factors, does not focus on the individual identification. Even though we can have risk profiles by worker, generally it focuses on the conditions of the organization. That is to say, it is very hard with the instruments that we nowadays have in order to measure psychosocial factors. We would determine whether a worker is simulating to be sick or is simulating that the organization is not working properly or no is not being a favorable organizational surroundings, such as described on the norm 035 in Mexico. Something important then I say is to consider that most of the analysis are ran in order to deal with these topics are performed in a joint way, in the statistical analysis that will allow us to determine which are the factors that are affecting workers or the working population, but there are not individuals within the organization. We have another question, an interesting one. It says, please, may you suggest a kind of form or questionnaire that may have two characteristics that would offer detection, evolution, kind of degree of stress present, and solution ways. And B, that may have legal procedures between health authorities. So it would be important to know which country the question comes from, because as Dr. Orbelin said, each and every one of the countries and the norms that we have analyzed have specific things that must be complied. There are some norms like the Mexican or Colombian that suggest some specific questionnaires to be applied. Some others that leave an open detection. Actually, they recommended to use validated instruments. Nevertheless, my psychometer colleagues, independently from using these validated instruments, it is also always important to report on the index of validity of the instruments, because when we're working with a different country or a different working population, it is important to report about this part. So regarding the detection of stress, it's the same thing. We have to have a very clear idea of which part of stress we want to evaluate, whether we want to evaluate stressors, that is to say that the stressing working environment, or a perception of stress. There's an instrument which is the perceived stress instrument. It has some variations, but there is validity in several countries. I insist, regardless they are already valid, it is important to report on the indexes they have, their samples have. And they would be officially validated. The repeated question again here. Okay, interesting question here. Are there any statistic data that would may indicate a reduction on the psychological effects by applying these laws, codes, or protocols? This is important because most of the studies that we've worked about have been with Nordic countries, such as Scandinavian countries. So all the research they run is actually from longitudinal character. They have a group of people that they follow along their working life, and they identify that these workers that are exposed to the stressors have different health problems all along their working life. So, and these problems may be physiological, psychological, or even, this is important because many of the manifestations of these things are seen after certain years. They're not immediate. So the interesting thing about our norms or regulations that we have analyzed, they are imported from these models of research that has been carried out in other countries, Scandinavian, most of them, but in general in Europe. But in some way, then we're, doing a good job in Latin America in the analysis and detection of these kind of factors. But let's say that in science, it tells us that there is a reduction in the psychological effects and even in health, as blood pressure. One more question. Thank you very much. Your research. I think I want to say that if these good practices for work quality life have been extended and trained the managers in Mexico, and they enhance the organizational so in such a way that this can be done in order to prevent and enhance these kind of issues in Mexico. The question is about Mexico. The norm is written so that the employer will be obliged to have surveillance and prevention and have preventive measures of psychosocial risk factors. So the managers and heads of the companies must be trained and they have to implement surveillance and prevention of these risk factors. Nevertheless, obviously, specialists such as Dr. Hill, and in our case, we are willing to give you any kind of advice. One more question to take a look at the, okay. Yes, as I said at the beginning, we're going to be uploading the article again. The research will be available and it will be sent by email to you. Which is the name of the article to see it? It's the policy study on psychosocial factor risks at work, identification, analysis, and prevention. It will be available also in our digital library. Is there any established preform to determine the existence of simulation? They ask us about, again, simulation. No, up until what I know, up to what I know, there is not established official form. I insist this kind of work is done by the analysis of groups in general of the organization, and they do not identify specific individuals.
Okay, me aclaran que la pregunta.
Okay, they tell me that about the question about simulation was from Mexico. So, but as I said it, there is no one, not one like that. Okay, about home office, non-regulated home office in our country, it creates burnout because we do not comply with the working schedule. That is something important that Dr. Jorge Ordelin was talking to us about. There are new stressors, there are new dynamics. Dr. Graciela Gil Montalvo was saying, these new realities and these new stressors at work that we're dealing with, they generate new scenarios to work with. And one of those is home office. And Dr. Jorge Ordelin was talking about it in the part of his speech. There's some working populations, those in they force the employers to have a surveillance of risks, but there are unprotected populations that do not have a benefit of the detection of these risk factors. Did you consider to evaluate the norms related to analysis of risks, work organization, and the federal law of work as a limitation for the application of Norm 035 according to parts A and B? This does not consider people from the public sector. Yeah, there are some populations that are not considered within these norms. Nevertheless, if we're talking about Norm 035, what it states very clearly is that all work centers greater than 15 countries, from 15 to 50 countries, and more than 50 workers are forced to have this evaluation of psychosocial risk factors. Those that have more than 15 workers or 50 workers are also forced by other kind of intervention, not through the guides that they're publishing or issuing or offering within the norm, but in a more qualitative way through interviews with their workers. Good afternoon. An interesting topic. Stress as a disease originated by work may be considered as a work risk. This, I don't know whether if you would like to talk about this, it's a low factor here. I think it is not being considered as disease or labor disease. Well, it all depends on the regulation of every country. There are countries that establish it for certain kind of work. But in the case of the Colombian, they offer a wider regulation and they take it into consideration because, as Javier said, they do not contemplate the risk factors, but also positive aspects. But other countries do not contemplate this. Now it has to do with one more question to finish with time. They were talking about harassment, sexual harassment, according Norm 035, is not seen by then. It's a matter of regulation. There should be another norm that would regulate how to face harassment. We compare or contrast this regulation with the one in Chile. The protocol that establishes this, it contemplates sexual harassment as part of, or when we define the concept of harassment, of one of the factors. It all depends on the regulation. So this is important to have this contrasted vision. The other important thing to consider is how you are going to deal with each and every one of these factors. The norm refers to these factors that are normally or are established with a non-expressed character, but they're established as examples. But it is in this study, we say it, Mexico considers when they define harassment, they define it's not sexual harassment, it's not considered within this consideration of harassment. We have many more questions, and for the sake of time, we're going to leave without any answer, but we're going to deal with all of them in a written way. I would like to close. Many people ask us if there is a real effect and which instruments they may use. And as I said, there are some legislation, like in the case of the Mexican or the Colombian one, they have a predetermined instrument, but it is important that all people or all decision makers in the companies and organizations would identify particular risks of their population of workers. That is to say, if you hire a consultant, consider that your consultant may offer a tailored detection to your needs of your labor or working population and their context. So unhappily, the instruments and laws that we analyze are pretty general, but it is also very important to consider all the part also. So we have to, by the moment of detection, we have to be very precise with the population that we're working with. So I insist, we really thank you for the sake of time. We'll continue answering your questions. We're gonna have a very little pause. Please do not disconnect, and we're going to close with a comment by Dr. Irma Juarez, who is with us this morning.
Estamos de vuelta. Vamos a cerrar la actividad, les decía.
So we're back, and we're just going to close today's activity with some remarks from Dr. Juarez. We have a privilege to have her today with us. She's also an expert on this subject matter, psychosocial risk factors. Dr. Irma Juarez Perez has a master's degree in occupational hygiene and safety. She's a quality auditor and has diploma courses on health and workplace. She was a coordinator of work security from the Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social and has been an external consultant from the ILO. And she's currently an academic consultant for Inter-American Center on Social Security. Dr. the floor is yours. Hello to all our audience, and I'm really happy to be here participating in this final remarks. It is really my honor because I've seen the work that you've put together in this commission. You're very committed and actually very centralized on human factor, which from my point of view should be the guiding axis of any organization. So after reading your very professional and very impactful research, I'm sure that the society will be impacted nationally and throughout Latin America. So in terms of remarks or closing remarks, I might say that in your work, you mentioned that standardization needs to be dynamic because whether public or private organizations are dynamic. I mean, even if some processes are semi-automated in private sector, they're ruled and executed by human factors. So these human capital, these human assets, will render productivity to said organization. So coming from there in your piece of research, I can see that very correctly you make this link to the root cause, which is real and what's necessary to each organization. So from my top management focus, I think that's what we need. To be able to be assertive, you need to carry out a proper diagnosis. And in your research, you start from there. From every country in the American and the Caribbean should have a good regulatory framework guiding psychosocial risk factors. And just stressing here in Mexico, prior to the pandemic, I cannot say we're honored by it, but I'm ashamed saying that prior to pandemic, Mexico was #1 worldwide when it comes to work stress, closely followed second by the United States, and #3, China, but Mexico led that item. So we need to delve deeper in this strategic planning process organization so as to avoid downtimes and affecting that human capital. So again, your research tends to prioritize, again, this human factor. I was also able to see in your research that you're prioritizing the body formed by a human being, and we know that human beings feed her or himself through perceptions, and these perceptions will in turn give us emotions that will result in attitudes. And if we see that an increase or a greater percentage for work-related accidents happens due to hazardous actions or the attitudes, behaviors of the worker, I see that you have an adequate outlook, an adequate scope for your research, and that you're correctly centralizing and you know where you're heading towards with prioritizing human factor. So you also highlight the fact that it's necessary to be able to measure this kind of quote unquote emotional temperature of organizations as something prioritary. And I applaud you for it because provided that you have an adequate emotional health within the organizational structure, coming from the root cause, you'll be able to tend psychosocial risk factors. That is to say, that regulations should not go to the consequence, but rather assessing the results. So it's also transcendent that in the dynamic of regulation, we can go to root cause factors, like I've mentioned, these perceptions, this emotional health I mentioned, and in post-pandemic times, we've seen that these are vulnerated in all personal working in public and private sectors. Public, when it comes to services, especially health staff should be considered independently in pandemic times. So the companies that contribute to Social Security, they do require planning and profitability. How can I be able to still carry out with my business? And how can I provide globally that competitiveness that will allow me to go to profitability? That's why I do believe in three structural levels of the organization. That's your study. They're vulnerable to work stress. Many times we see in the operational base that there is work-related stress, and you need to tend to that base, which represents the operational human factor. But middle management related to that operation, so that there's productivity for profitability, and whatever is fed to top management are also extremely prone to suffering from work stress. And obviously, top management is trying to survive post-pandemic times because their human capital, should be healthy and productive. That's why this piece of research allows us or invites us to open up to emotional health in these three branches, and also health in terms of psychosocial risks. And going again back to that root cause, that's where you get a lot of diseases from psychosomatic nature, and this goes in hand. If we try to tend that root cause when it comes to psychosocial risk factors, we will have a company that's more prone to achieving a biopsychosocial balance. So that's my contribution. And without further ado, I would like to congratulate you because it's a very pertinent research that will put the Inter-American Center on Studies of Social Security in a very high position, led by Dr. Daisy Corrales, our director from the CIESS. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and talk with you. Thank you very much, Doctor, for your commentary, final remarks. Thank you very much to our audience. I wouldn't like to say goodbye without telling you that we're willing and able to provide consultancy to our member countries in all these regards, all these subject matters, and you will be receiving this document shortly. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, this broadcast. Thank you.